the ways in which we operate in our societies in exactly what Kyle was talking about. The way that we value reciprocity, the way that we value gratitude, all of these core central values of our community are they're inalienable, like our lands, to our identities. They are a core part of where we come from and how I guess, we are in right relation with each other and with the land and with all beings on this planet. And reciprocity is a big value system within that. And within the justice framework, as we move towards justice, when we talk about decolonizing, it invites a possibility for justice. It responds to many of the calls here in Canada, to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, calls to action, missing and murdered women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, and it affirms the importance that Indigenous peoples, our rights, and our knowledge is critical in decision making, and it welcomes the idea and the opportunity for two-eyed seeing approaches to collectively move together to create the best solutions to address the climate crisis. And it's really, really critical that the framework is not simply just about degrading the climate crisis to the reduction of emissions. We have to address the root causes that have got us there, and that is really facing the fact that colonization brought with it patriarchy, capitalism, extractivism, and the violence to Indigenous peoples, and attempted genocide. And if we don't face those, then we are not going to actually achieve justice. We will just equalize GHGs in the atmosphere, and Indigenous and other marginalized groups will continue to be the sacrifices for the status quo of white supremacy.
When we spoke earlier, Ariel, you mentioned that part of the reason that you started the Indigenous Climate Action was because there wasn't an Indigenous led organization in Canada before. How do you think the creation of this organization has changed the conversation around climate change and Indigenous ways of knowing?
Well, first off, there's lots of Indigenous organizations
Yeah,
in
yeah, of
Canada.
course.
Many, many, many. There's just none working specifically on climate justice. And there are other organizations that don't have a climate justice focus that are working on climate justice issues, but we are centered wholly on climate justice. So, how that's changed the discourse and changed things in Canada is that what I'm going to say so-called Canada because it's a colonial state, so-called. There's many contentious regions of this country that are still in dispute over who the rightful owners are, much of those places being Indigenous lands and territories. But we have to recognize the fact that prior to Indigenous climate action, the environmental movement and the push for climate policy and climate justice was primarily led by white ENGOs, white environmental organizations, and those are primarily led by white middle class folks. That prior to the development of ICA, it's not that these organizations didn't speak of or acknowledge Indigenous rights and knowledge systems, but we were tokenized. And there was a minimization of what the input and our knowledge actually held in sort of pushing for and advocating for stronger solutions, better solutions, pushing policy. And there was really this rush to just get out the door to be like, who's got the best solution and putting it forward with, like, again, missing the justice component. There was this continuation of just like, well, the climate crisis is so urgent and we just have to go forward. This is as good as we're going to get with this government kind of ideology, and just continuing to leave Indigenous communities behind in the conversation and really not upholding tenets of internationally recognized and affirmed rights under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. In Canada, we have a huge problem with being stuck on what I call the C of FPIC, which has been degraded to simply consultation. And it's not even consent anymore. And they're just like, oh, well, we consulted, so therefore it's FPIC. And it's that consultation is not FPIC. FPIC is free of intimidation, coercion, and manipulation. Prior means beforehand, with enough time before these things have even been contemplated and developed into policies or even a draft policy. And informed means they have to have access to this information in whatever language is accessible. So it should be accessible in the languages of the community, accessible to those communities in a way that they understand and can process. And then they get to determine whether or not they want to or don't want to participate or want to like be a part of like these new policy ideas and strategies. But what we saw instead was these organizations and governments just going to communities after not engaging with them for decades and saying, all these NGOs say that Indigenous rights and knowledge are super important. So what do you want? And these communities are like, what do you mean? What do you want? Well, they're like, there's a climate crisis. So tell us what your solutions are. And they weren't ready. And then the NGOs go, you know what? Well, what are we supposed to do? We made space for them. We created the space, but there's no investment in developing the infrastructures of our communities and the resources and the capacities. And ICA saw this gap, like the Indigenous Climate Action and the founders, we saw this huge gap that there was so much investment and resources put into white environmental activism and resources. And those resources were going towards changing the minds of politicians and colonial governments and states, and no resources being put in building up the infrastructure of communities to take those positions in those seats that they kept saying, look, we created the space for. And so there has been a shift in how we see Indigenous participation in this country. And there is now a growing critique of what it means for Indigenous peoples to not just be tokenized people on a stage or at a meeting, but what it means for us to have direct input in actually developing strategies from the ground up, from Indigenous values, from Indigenous communities to actually change the face of what climate solutions in this country can look like.
I'm curious, do you find that people who have been doing this kind of work are rushing towards those seats? Maybe people who are considered elders or people who have been doing climate work for the last 20 or 30 years, or is it young people who are really sort of like running at those opportunities and seeing like I'm really invested in climate issues and I want to you know be in that space from the moment they're available.
I would say it's pretty mixed, to be totally fair. We have a mix of young folks and elders, and but at the same time, they're also acknowledging that there has been this sort of gap in the struggle. So while there's seats, people are taking those spaces, and they're not just going there to like be like, I have all the answers and solutions, and I represent all Indigenous peoples. Because let's be real, Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada and the so-called United States are so diverse. We are as diverse as the biodiversity and the biomes of this country, and even more so. There are over 300 or 630 First Nations communities, over 50 Inuit settlements, and I think there's over 50 Métis settlements in this country, probably closer to 100 at this point. So that's over 700 Indigenous nations and groups in this country. And no single person can enter in and sit at the table and say, I speak for all Indigenous peoples of this colonial state. And I don't think anyone goes to those positions and says that. I think a lot of these folks are holding that space and trying to hold those people in those spaces accountable to the sort of the gaps that they have and the I guess the damage that they've done prior to. Like it's not just about going there and being like, here's the solutions, here's the answer, which a lot of the environmental NGOs do. I've seen it, I've watched it firsthand where they come up with some critique, come up with some paper, and then they tell the governments this is the solution, we need to go, and then they pat themselves on the back when governments adopt it. Whereas Indigenous folks, that's definitely not the approach. It's always about we need to take time to talk about reciprocity, to talk about what it means to work in consensus decision making processes, and it's about listening ultimately to the land. And that is a huge fundamental like values and ways of going about things that is so divergent that causes so many tensions when we bring Indigenous peoples with Indigenous knowledge as their core values to the tables with colonial structures and the ways of decision making. It's very challenging. And so, when we talk about like these ways of affirming Indigenous knowledges and experiences and worldview, we are interrupting the norms, and we're able to really challenge these systems and moving towards new approaches that move towards that justice framework. And it's such a beautiful thing that we've seen, whereas it's not just people rushing to assert power and be in those systems of power that are traditionally within those structures of white supremacy. White supremacy is surrounded on hyper individualism, accumulation of wealth and notoriety, whereas Indigenous peoples, it's about centering community in our approaches.
I love that. Thank you so much, Ariel. Kyle, I would love to hear more about the committee that you are on for the White House. How has being a part of that sort of changed your perspective on, I guess, our future? Maybe that's too big of a question. But how has being part of that committee, what has that meant to you and your work?
So I think we're at a really critical juncture right now for environmental and climate justice, and we're going to really have to change how we think about justice and equity. And what I wanted to just share right now in response to your question, I definitely see as related to what Ariel has just shared in the important work that they're doing and that they're describing and talking about right now. So every situation of colonialism, if you look at the history of colonialism, the people that perpetrate colonialism, they justify in their own minds what they're doing because they say there's a crisis. And that creates a delusion that some of the most horrific violence and harm is somehow acceptable. And each generation, and we're currently in a generation right now, they just believe so firmly that what they're doing couldn't possibly be as bad as what came before. But I think we really need to think very critically about how a lot of very dominant forms of environmentalism are responding to crisis thinking in a way it's actually just not even helpful to think of it as any different as what came before. And the reason why on the White House Council, this is one of the issues that we're dealing with, is that in the so-called for U.S. context, uh, people of color, Native people included, are what won the vote for the Democrats. In the state that I live in, the so-called state of Michigan, Native people of color came out, won the election, took what was originally a 10,000 vote margin, and transformed it into a victory for the Democrats in Michigan. And so the Democrat and the Biden administration have then made huge promises that they're going to engage in huge infrastructure spending. But what we know is that the current setup of the US system right now, there are not the relationships, there are not the moral bonds, there are not the institutional setups for that investment to go anywhere but to privileged people. The investment will go to contractors that have nothing to do with Native people. The money will go to projects that can't even get off the ground because there's no understanding through a consent process that in order to have renewable energy, you need to deal with the electrification grid disinvestment of the past, the road system, the broadband and telecommunications. And so we're at a time where a lot of environmentalists are seeing environmental justice and infrastructure as the calling of environmentalism, climate change mitigation, and justice, but they're so urgent and adamant about it, and they're just focused on that one single goal that they're ignoring the severe lack of kinship that's been festering for generations, which will make it so every single good idea actually is associated with an inequity, with a displacement of Indigenous people, with a situation that marginalizes Indigenous people economically, that entrenches dependence on energy from others, that creates continuous vulnerability to coastal erosion or other climate change impacts. And so we're right now in a time, and the literature itself, whether it's testimonies of Native persons, Indigenous leaders, or the academic literature showing that clean and renewable energy projects are deeply problematic for Indigenous people everywhere in the world, whether from an economic standpoint, a cultural standpoint, a displacement, land tenure, land sovereignty standpoint. And so on our council, one of the responsibilities we had was to give advice on what's called the Justice 40 initiative, which is that 40% of the benefits of billions of dollars of federal investments in infrastructure has to be for communities affected by environmental justice. But what does benefit mean? Why is it even stated that way? The benefits of investments? And so in the recommendations and in all of the hours and hours of conversation that we had, and there's 26 people in the council, all of whom, no matter their ages, are very dedicated and experienced environmental justice activists with some with just decades of experience. But we had to hit that question hard. What does it mean? Benefit? What does it mean to make an investment that is meaningful, that does advance equity, that does represent or that does protect the environment? And so right now, this area that I think many people just thought was the domain of practice, right? I think a lot of us are like, no, that's not a domain of practice. There's not theory and practice. What there are institutional arrangements. And when you have a colonial system, those institutional arrangements, and I include actual relationships and emotional bonds, they're not in a position where people can act in a coordinated fashion and achieve equity and justice. And they've not been like that for years. And so whenever somebody recognizes that maybe their solutions are not implementable, they shouldn't just try to create more innovation in the solution itself, but realize, wait a minute, maybe I have the wrong focus. Maybe my focus should be on repairing kinship, be repairing the institutional arrangements, be focusing on what it means to have a truly consensual system, a truly reciprocal system, and that has to come in with equal importance as the goal of mitigating climate change. And so I think for a lot of environmentalists from dominant groups, they may have to realize that when your urgency is only driven by climate change mitigation, that why isn't your urgency also driven by a need to repair bonds among people, by a need to prepare the grounds for justice and equity? Why isn't that just as urgent?
Ariel, I would love to offer you some space to. I saw just so much encouraging nodding during that, so I'd love to give you some space to respond.
Honestly, I just like agree with all of that so full-heartedly. Like we fundamentally disconnect our our humanity really from the crisis. We've disconnected it so much that it's just about like, oh, like let's figure out how to change the energy systems. Let's figure out how to reduce the particles in the atmosphere as if they're just like a thing that we can manipulate and play with. But the reality is we live on a planet that is interconnected and interdependent. And when we relegate or actually devolve what it means to benefit from something, particularly in that aspect, I am so familiar with this because I come from a community that's impacted by industrial development in Canada. The largest industrial project on planet Earth, which is the Alberta tar sands, is upstream from my community. And part of that whole project was people were opposing, they were challenging, they were saying, oh, these projects are destroying the land, destroying the water, destroying our food sources, destroying our culture, all the things. And the government said, okay, well, let's just figure out how these communities can benefit from these projects, which created this whole process in Canada known as the impact benefit agreement process, which are private proprietary agreements that are negotiated between the proponents, so the corporations, multinational corporations, and the First Nations to determine what the benefit is. And at the beginning, and it's everything. It's not always just money. It's like because our communities didn't want the money. Our communities like we don't want the money. We want to be able to fish. We want to be able to access our lands and territories. And these companies were like, okay, so we'll build a compensation lake. These are things that they have literally created in our territory where they dig a hole and put a bunch of water in and take fish from the lake or the water system they're destroying and put it over there. And then, but indigenous knowledge and our intergenerational knowledge has no relevance. We don't know this lake, we don't know this land, we don't know these fish that are displaced here. It's not the same. That interrelationship that Kyle talked about, that relationship with the land, the relationship with each other, we don't have it with this made up compensation lake. And so we really have to think about, like, what does benefit mean? Benefit is not about how much money we have, which is, the primary motive of, sort of colonial societies and white supremacy, accumulation of wealth and notoriety. For us, it's about that relationship. Do I know this land? Do I know these species? Do I know my kin next door? Do I trust them? Can I build relationships with them? Can we trade? Can we build a society that is like equal, where we all have a part in this interconnectedness that we all have? And yet, that urgency that pushes in the sort of modern environmental world often continues to alienate Indigenous peoples, putting forth environmental principles that actually continue to invisibilize that Indigenous worldview and subsequently our rights and our title along with it. And this neglects and perpetuates this neglect, rather, like this neglect, like the neglect of our rights, and recognizing those worldviews as pertinent and relevant to the climate solutions, it perpetuates these white supremacist notions of how to address the current climate catastrophe, further entrenching racial injustice within environmental movements and specifically within climate action movements.
Kyle, you work often with graduate students who are hopefully what they're part of what their this program is doing is actually asking them to address and really think about these systems that they can then move into the world and help to dismantle. Are you finding that that mental shift is either easy for them to find, where they maybe think they come into a program thinking, oh, I can find all of these solutions and implement them, whereas perhaps part of your program, what it's doing is asking them to think more about the systems which need to be dismantled. Do you find that the students are ready for that kind of mental switch?
Yeah, great question, Diana. So, in terms of higher education, I really don't believe that higher education is necessarily a better institution than some of the other ones that are out there that are available to us, whether it's working for the US government or tribal government or working for NGOs. All of these are institutions that, we as Indigenous people and numerous other communities, we didn't design these systems. We didn't create these systems. But for those of us that work in them and who have that role and that responsibility in relation to our communities, we have to find the institutions that we can at least tolerate enough to be in them for a long enough period of time, even if it's not very long, to have actually a protective or a significant impact for the lands and the people that matter to us. And so I think for our higher education system, a lot of students, come into a program that you might have some faculty that are pushing not only systems thinking but historical thinking and thinking in a way that validates communities and that validates diverse systems of knowledge. But insofar as most college campuses I'm aware of are like these sort of indoor classroom based environments with field trips here and there, um, that really isn't going to do it. Um, and speaking of infrastructure, we really need to think that the geography of most university campuses, not only the fraught relationship to the theft of indigenous land, but just the whole setup can't possibly be a place where the type of generative learning would occur. And so, in terms of the work I do my best within that particular context, but I don't apologize for the restrictions. And I'm proud of students that have taken it as their calling to seek reform and change and push for transformation in a very restrictive system. But I think we always have to keep in mind that there are so many better ways to do it. I mean, we should be learning from experience. We should be learning from all types of knowledge keepers. We should be learning in a land-based context, not a context that's attempting to sanitize itself from greater connectivity to the land. And we have to be learning in ways that are directly tied to actual projects in the world. And the program I'm in in comparison to others, certainly we have project-based curriculum, we have practice-based curriculum, and we have many faculty that are committed to the types of things that I'm talking about. But if we don't fundamentally alter the very infrastructure, the very geography, the very land that the university educational experience takes for granted, then I don't think that we're doing the service that we're supposed to be doing for students that are hungry for the type of training that can really make a change.
So your work is in Michigan, Kyle. Do you have knowledge of any local organizations or communities that are doing this kind of work in Connecticut as well? Because I think a lot of the people who are joining us, of course, hopefully from across the country and world, but I'm wondering if there are any if people are looking for are living in Connecticut and so-called Connecticut, I should say, and are looking for some of these projects, what ones might you point them to?
Yeah, with indigenous work, I think people really need to open their minds because the majority of work that Native people do, including work on climate change. It's not work that's out there in the media. It's not work that is publicized. And so a lot of the people I connect with when I visit a community I've never been in before, you see how much is happening and how much has been happening. And there's stories of what Native people have done generations ago, including being some of the people that were there at some of the earliest stages of dominant forms of climate science, but that their stories and their histories are forgotten by the academic literature that has documented those periods of time. And so, it's important to note that everywhere where there's tribes or native communities, there's so much happening. And when I was an author on the fourth U.S. National Climate Assessment, we found that there were at that time, which was 2018, over 800 actions that Native people were taking on climate change. And that actually didn't even include figures on a lot of the indigenous environmental justice resistance to pipelines and to other fossil fuel infrastructure. And so now that same figure has well over 1,000. And if you add the other things I said were missing, that's many more. It's way over 2,000. And then if you take what I've learned from experience is that all such statistics like that only cover about a third of what's actually happening. We're talking about a population of just several million people with thousands of actions. And if you look at the state of Michigan, which has 10 million people, there are not even 1,000 climate change activities, right? Beyond what indigenous people are doing. And so, in kind of resisting the state framework, I encourage people to think about the important work that the tribes in that region are doing. And a number of native persons. I mean, I've had a collaboration on different projects with an intertribal group that has many tribes that are from, so-called Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Maine, and that area. It's called the United South and Eastern Tribes, and they work to coordinate climate change plans of different types with those tribes, whether it's energy plans or climate change adaptation plans. So, I completely agree and appreciate Eriel's point that actually, when you look in practice, these things are braided together in terms of the people that are actually doing them. But if you look, for example, at like the Passamaquoddy tribe, they've done tremendous work on energy planning and climate change planning. And they're facing some serious threats, but they're getting ready for the future. I'm very inspired with the work that they're doing. But then on the other hand, there's been tribes like the Mashpee Wampanoag that have struggled against some of the solutions of climate change. There's been a longstanding struggle against wind turbines and their cultural impacts, and a lack of understanding of what cultural impact really means for Native people that are concerned about that. Uh, uh, as well as issues tied to policies that make it very hard for Native people to exercise sovereignty over land, and which have a very problematic impact, especially on tribes in Connecticut and Massachusetts and the broader region. So I'd really encourage folks to check out both like the United South and Eastern tribes, but also scholars from tribes in the area like Dr. Kelsey Leonard at Waterloo University and others. I think there's a lot that people can plug into and learn about if they seek that information from the tribes and the communities themselves.
One of the things I keep hearing both of you saying that I want to just spend a little bit of time on too is how important language is in all of this. So, not just, of course, making sure that we're going back and respecting and revitalizing indigenous languages that may have been, forced out of people and communities, but also the language that we're using in English and other languages and the languages of colonizers, to make sure that we're thinking differently. And I guess I wonder what do you think language what role do you think language plays in all of this talking about and preparing for climate change? Ariel, I'd love to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that language has a huge, huge part in this, and like we we can't like separate the fact that we have this history of the Americas that's steeped in violent colonization and attempted genocide of indigenous peoples, and we often we see that, we talk about it, we've kind of sort of made, I don't want to say peace with it, but like a lot of folks know that that's part of the history. But within that history, we don't talk about the fact that there was this demonization and devaluing of indigenous value systems, cosmology, and life. And this demonization still continues to, when I say demonization, I mean for real. Like they were like, indigenous people are heathens, they are backwards, they're barbaric, all of these really, really things that made us like to be feared. We're feared, and we're still seeing that because like when you ask about climate action and looking for indigenous peoples, what are they doing? Climate action for indigenous folks is opposing a pipeline like we saw with the no dapple movement, or that we're seeing with line 3 currently up in the northern states, which state I can't remember, in Minnesota. And we're seeing with all of these oppositions to projects. But it's also climate justice when we talk about those that are challenging some of the sustainable solutions like wind and solar, because those solutions are still rooted in those foundations that have dispossessed us of our lands, see us as less, that still demonize us and vilify us as criminals in our own lands and territories, where we don't have a say in what it means for climate justice, for energy just futures, for all of those suite of solutions that we talk about. And our ideas and the ways in which we approach climate solutions are still looked at as barbaric. I've heard people go, oh, so you want us to live in teepees and communicate with smoke signals, as if that's what indigenous solutions look like to the climate crisis. But we're modern people, and we have evolved. We're not static. There's this illusion that indigenous people are somehow static, and that we're striving to return to some version of ourselves in the past. But indigenous peoples were in processes of evolution just like anyone else. And contrary to this really, really overbearing myth that innovation didn't occur in the Americas until colonization started, like, let's not forget that indigenous peoples of the Americas invented aspirin, rubber, baby nipples for the bottles to feed children, uh, you know, sort of iterations of soap and cleaning products, like the laundry list, lacrosse, so many different things that were appropriated and we were never given credit for until sort of now. And even then, it's still marginal. And that has to do with language. It has to do with how we see and view indigenous peoples as mystical, magical, romanticized versions of something of the past, as if we don't currently exist in this current space and time. And we can't just say, oh, we respect indigenous knowledge. Respecting is not actually implementing. It's one thing to be like, I respect that you don't like broccoli. We have to talk about like, what does it mean to implement indigenous rights? We have to go beyond just giving it lip service and actually move towards what it means to implement the indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. When folks say we don't want a wind turbine, that we're no longer vilified, and that we're looked at and go, okay, so what would it be? Because there are white communities that have opposed similar things, and they've gotten those projects moved to another location that probably displaces another community of color or marginalized community. And we have to like really start talking about what that means, and also challenging my own self, because I use marginalized a lot. Marginalized, what does that mean? That means that we're like pushed off to the side. And we're not marginalized. We're like oppressed peoples because we've been oppressed. We've been othered by white society, and we have to like start talking about ways to empower ourselves and not keep ourselves in this state of victimhood, because that serves white supremacy to keep us as victims. And so we have to empower ourselves to be sovereign, self-determined, and assert that our value systems, our knowledge systems, and our ways of being are not something to be vilified and demonized any longer. And that really comes down to the ways in which we speak about our people and we speak about these solutions. These aren't alternatives. These are solutions that we have been utilizing for centuries and decades, and then the alternatives are being proposed by white colonial society.
Kyle, I'd love to invite you to also, speak with us a little bit about language. What does it mean to have and to put a lot of emphasis on the way that we're speaking about climate change and the language that we're using?
I really appreciate what Eriel shared about language and all the complexity to the points that they made. I mean, that really has me thinking about a lot of connections, and I'd like to mention a dimension of language as well. Indigenous languages, and I think it's important for people to note that language is complicated for Indigenous communities. On the one hand, right, a lot of Indigenous persons I know, grew up speaking English or French or Spanish. And then their communities may have various connections to either those languages. Native people oftentimes speak the languages in a way that's different, that has a different significance and meaning and communicative value to it. But then also their own languages, right? And historically, it wasn't that each tribe had its own language, but actually there was multi-fluency, right? There were diplomacies. I mean, Native people historically would speak many different languages, just like we see in different parts of the world today that haven't had linguistic genocide, at least to the degree that our communities faced it. And so for some communities, they're protecting their fluency of one or two languages. Others are awakening their languages. And regardless of where that community or any community is in relation to their language, there's a significance of an indigenous language that can't be devalued by our colleagues in the dominant society. And so, for example, I am oftentimes part of discussions or consultations or policy situations where you'll see, say, a non-native scientist or engineer, and I recently have been in some situations where this has come up with regard to Enbridge's Line 5 pipeline that goes through the Mackinac Straits, which is a sacred and significant area for Anishinaabe people. And it's a pipeline that needs well, we need to get rid of it, but it's out of date. And there's a proposal by Enbridge to completely replace it, which would be a huge tunneling project. And some scientists and engineers that discuss it, they might say things like, and I've seen people say things, that the animal or plant communities, yeah, they're going to be disrupted, but they're not like super rare communities. They're not, they'll bounce back. And all right, fine. But then you'll have somebody who's, say, like a culture keeper, a culture bearer, or knowledge keeper from one of the effective communities, then start talking about those ecosystems and those plants, but using their language, not relying on English, and using those terms, evoking those sounds, providing illustrations that show relationships. And that's what sacred, that's what rare, that's what significant, that's what valuable means from an indigenous perspective. And you can't, and going back to Eriel's really good point about replacement, that can't be replaced by an equivalent that emanates from the value system of the dominant society. That's a value that the language itself gives some guidance on what that value means, but you have to take the language seriously. You have to understand that those words, and again, even words as an artificial construct, right? But those sounds, those phrases, those meanings, oftentimes talk about the social activities that were connected to those plants or animals. They also denote the entire history associated with it. And I know in English we oftentimes don't think that way. We think that a word just has to have all of the meaning and definition just stuffed into that one term, and we get these dictionaries that have whole paragraphs just describing what one word could mean. But for Native folks, a lot of our languages they connote, they denote whole contexts and histories that we have to share in dialogue with others about. And that for us, right, that invocation of language is it defines what safety means, what sacred means, what culturally significant means. And so, for that reason, in climate mitigation or in the perpetuation of fossil fuels and extractive industries, our language just need to be asserted into those contexts, and non-native people have to respect our languages, and they have to understand that they can't possibly try to articulate or apologize for or think that they've understood what those meanings were. They have to allow us to define what safe enough means, what culturally significant means, what sovereignty means. That's for us to define. It's not for them to define. And they need to respect our languages and how they convey that significance.
So we've talked a little
I
bit
just want to
about how science. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I just want to add Danica Littlechild, who was one of the original folks on ICA's steering committee. She said, "We are our own experts. We don't have to constantly be translating ourselves through a colonial lens." And that is an important articulation that I think is just like that. She sort of resonated everything that Kyle said. And I always say it because it's true. We are our own experts. We don't have to be translating ourselves through a colonial lens all the time. It's time for us to take our power back and understand that importance. And I'm also reminded of when, prior to a lot of this work, I worked for the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations in Saskatchewan working on land claims. And there was this land claim where a bunch of land was destroyed over a long period of time. And there was all these ecologists trying to figure out how to compensate this nation for the losses they had. And the nation said, "Are you going to compensate us for everything?" And they said, "Well, we're going to compensate you for like, significant species to your culture." And they said every single one of them were. And they ended up having to go down the list of everything from every kind of flora and fauna, from the rats and the raccoons to the muskrats to the trees to the grasses to the flowers and the medicine. And these ecologists and economists were just like, "We can't possibly value every single living species." And they're like, "Those are all the things that are significant species to our culture and identity." And they were just like, "Oh my God, this is impossible." And they gave up trying to evaluate everything because it became an impossible task. And that just sort of hits the nail on the head of what Kyle was saying, because it's like impossible to evaluate and to replace those things.
I mean, impossible to value in this Western system, right? Yeah, exactly. I wonder too about, so we've been talking about the role of science and the role of language, and I wonder about, this is the Arts and Ideas Festival, and I wonder if you have a few moments to talk a little bit about the role of art as well. Eriel, I know that you have been sort of on the front lines of a lot of protests and activism, and so I'm sure I would love to start with you and just talk a little bit about, yeah, the role of art in this in this process.
Art is such a powerful medium, and it is actually really center part of Indigenous culture as well. My dad is a storyteller and an artist. Like, he draws and he paints and he writes, and so art has just been a big part of my life. But it's so critical and it's so powerful. Like, art and activism go hand in hand. Like, some of the most creative and most amazing art I've seen at protests, from puppets to chants to the music to the ways in which people show up, it is really an art form. And with that in vain, ICA really, really, really empowers our people to look at art as that practice. We have a lot of short films and documentaries on our YouTube channel. We have a Flickr account, and we're just about to launch our podcast. I believe we're going to launch it next week. I think that's when it's coming out, as long as I finish listening to all of them and make sure they're good to go. But we will be launching the ICA pod next week, which will be focusing on a diversity of issues regarding climate justice with youth and elders, and just transition and healing justice and all those components. But these different types of art forms are central to shifting change, because we're moving away from this idea of hyper productivity and working for that working for the man and making the money and living the American dream, and really leaning into this idea of joy, what it means to create something as opposed to extract and, gain power over something else. And art has this beautiful way of sort of really tempering that and bringing us to a place of joy and creativity.
Kyle, what about you? How has art played a role in maybe your work or the work that others you've been connected with?
Absolutely. And I first wanted to encourage everybody who is tuning in or will tune into our conversation to definitely follow the Indigenous Climate Action podcast that's forthcoming. That's absolutely amazing. And I look forward to it. When I remember at different, in different years when I'm working a lot on funding policy for tribal climate change planning, one of the assumptions has always been, how do we fund more science? How do we increase the amount of scientists in tribes? Yet, with every tribe that I've either worked with directly on their climate change work or who I've interacted with through one of the educational programs I've been part of, like Tribal Climate Camp or the Indigenous Planning Summer Institute, uh, they didn't need more science. Actually, it's support for the arts that's most missing, because from a tribal climate change planning perspective, the media arts, the visual arts, the performance arts, uh, that's really how you bring an entire community together around a coordinated approach to addressing climate change. And or yet that's the arts are probably the least funded area in any so-called US climate change funding program. And if I asked a certain number of scientists or federal employees or officials I knew where they rank the importance of the arts in like hardcore climate change planning, they would say it's not very important. Yet actually what makes a climate change plan for a tribe something that will be practiced and implemented, people will care about, is if it's infused with indigenous arts. Uh, and that is the most practical way. That is the most action oriented way. And notice that that really requires, at least for some people we probably know, a big change in their perspective on the relationship between sciences and arts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that a lot of people are starting to think about, but it's hard to know how much movement we're making in that way sometimes. But um, I'm glad to hear, it's encouraging to hear that there are people who are putting the arts and sciences side by side and making them a part of you know, uh, the same structure and the
Mm.
same movement. That's exciting to hear. Well, we're almost at the end of our time together, but I wanted to give both of you a chance just to let people know if they're interested in finding out more, either about your work or the work that you're doing within the organizations that you're a part of. How can they find out more? How can they get more involved? Ariel.
Yeah, you can check us out on on the internet where everyone is these days because of the pandemic. So www.indigenousclimateaction.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel and a Flickr account. You can access that all from our website. But check us out, and if you can donate, we are a nonprofit organization trying to hustle and make it in this world where only like 1% of the philanthropic dollars go towards Indigenous work. So we need all the support we can get, and we'd love to have you join our listserv and get involved
And listen to the podcast too. I'm very excited for this forthcoming
and
podcast.
listen to the podcast. I'm really excited for the podcast too, actually.
Amazing. Kyle, what about you if people want to find out more, follow your work?
Sure, absolutely. So a couple of things that could be easily Googled. I've got my own website with information on things I've written and things that I'm doing. I'd also encourage folks to go to the website on Environmental Protection Agency for the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and scan all the way down, and you'll see where our interim recommendations are. Check out the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Climate Change Program page, and especially the part on the review of the Congressional Climate Crisis Action Plan. That has great information about where Indigenous people are at with some of their goals and aspirations for climate change. And check out the work that we do at the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. We're a coalition of different people of color organizations, and we're working on all sorts of issues affecting EJ in Michigan, and that have implications for environmental justice everywhere. And that, yeah, I would also add strongly encourage you to consider supporting our organizations like Indigenous Climate Action. It makes a huge difference, and I think you see the difference that they're making. It would be great to have many of you part of that difference making community.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for being here. It has been such a pleasure to speak with you for the 30 minutes that we spoke before this event, that I got to just ask you questions and chat with you one-on-one, and for this over hour time that you've given to all of us. So thank you again. I also want to thank Connecticut Public and all of the partners for the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. It is such a pleasure to be here today and to be able to gather with all of you, even if we can't gather in person. I cannot wait to continue to do these kinds of events and hear both of you speak at a lot of really amazing things where you can continue to spread your wisdom and get these ideas front and center. So thank you both again.
Thank you, Masicho.
Thank you. Miigwech.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And Elizabeth, it is so nice to see you again. And thank you again for inviting all of us to be here.
Thank you so much, Diana, Eriel, and Kyle. It has been a privilege to listen in and to be with you and all that you've brought to this conversation. I'm thinking deeply right now about the way reciprocity and kinship and interconnectedness show up in justice work and in the work that we have to do together. And I want to flag that we have a couple events honoring local Indigenous wisdom here with Indigenous writers next week, Indigenous food tomorrow. Rachel Sayette is going to be leading an Indigenous cooking demonstration tomorrow night. We have Indigenous writers from the Schaghticoke Nation, Golden Hill Paugussett, Eastern Pequot, and Mohegan Nations next week joining us. And we also have a panel next week around mutual aid. That's called The Legacy of Love as Liberation. So please join us in continuing to think about these things and looking and continuing to stay curious about the amazing work that Eriel, Kyle, and Diana are doing. Thank you all so much. And hopefully we'll see you all very soon. Have a great night.